So let's continue with these spinal meninges. So again, the pia mater, here kind of translucent, is the deepest layer. It's clinging to the surface of the spinal cord. And when we look at the brain, we'll see that the position of the meningeal layers are the same. And then the filum terminale is the far distal inferior extension of the pia mater that continues down to help anchor the spinal cord down at the coccyx. If you remember, the filum terminale begins right where the spinal cord ends at the conus medullaris. Oh, there you go. So there's the conus medullaris, color-coded in pink. And at the end of it, there's the filum terminale in yellow, helping to secure and anchor the spinal cord within the vertebral canal. And again, there it is on the model, that thin little filament right in the middle, surrounded by the cauda equina, horse's tail. Not really a horse's tail. Okay, so let's look at the spinal cord here in cross-section. So the central portion here in gray and pink, that's the spinal cord itself. And lateral to it, coming off, we can't see it here because it's covered up with the meningeal layers. Dura mater on top, remove it, pull it aside. There's the pia mater, dura mater. Next to it is the arachnoid mater, and on the surface of the spinal cord, the pia mater. So if we peel the meningeal layers apart, we can see the spinal cord and see how the rootlets come off of it, and they merge to form the root, in this case the anterior root. And on the back posterior side, we can't see the posterior rootlets, but we can see a bit of the posterior root, and they merge into one spinal nerve. All right? And this is the figure from your textbook that shows you a little bit of the rootlets and then the roots, and then there's that nice bulge here. That's a dorsal or posterior dorsal root ganglion, and then there's the spinal nerve. So that's posterior. Notice there's the spinous process posterior portion of the vertebral column. Okay. Oh, so then there are also these extensions called denticulate ligaments. They're extensions of the pia mater out laterally that help anchor the spinal cord to the dura mater and also kind of help tether and anchor the spinal cord within the vertebral canal. And that's these little extensions that you see here laterally, tan it looks like, extensions of the pia mater right here that go all the way out to the dura mater and again help anchor the spinal cord in place. Similar function as the filum terminale. Here's a dissection. There's the spinal cord, and the pia mater is delicate here, and then see where it kind of comes out. Those are the denticulate ligaments there, and there, and there, and here, and a little bit there to help anchor and tether the spinal cord in place. See how these structures here are kind of splayed out. Those are the rootlets, and then there's the root, and then there's the other root back there. So if this is the ventral, then those would be ventral rootlets, ventral root, and a little bit of the dorsal root coming out. And down here, or out here, is where you see the dorsal root ganglion. It's covered here, and then the spinal root comes out laterally. Okay? And the spaces, epidural space, this is between the vertebra, bone, and the dura mater, connective tissue. So it's the site of the epidural injections, if anyone's ever had that anesthetic injection. So the epidural space would be here, where you see the fat, and there, epidural space. Okay? So between the vertebral bone, vertebra, spinal cord itself, right there. Then there's the subarachnoid space. So this is a narrow space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. And there's a little gap in there, and it's filled with cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. And that's where you do a lumbar puncture, or where they would do a lumbar puncture to remove cerebrospinal fluid to check it for contaminants, etc., bad infections. So that should be labeled here, subarachnoid space, here in black, filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? And that's where they do the lumbar puncture or spinal tap. And they tend to do it down here. Notice the bones, the vertebra. This is L1 through L5, and there's the sacrum. So they tend to do the lumbar puncture spinal tap in this region of the vertebral canal, because notice there's the end of the spinal cord, the conus medullaris, and inferior to it are spinal nerves. So see the cauda equina. So the needle goes in, pushes past the epidural space, punctures into the outermost dura mater, punches past the arachnoid mater, and gets all the way into the subarachnoid space filled with cerebrospinal fluid to draw out some of the cerebrospinal fluid. But again, the reason they do it down here is that there's no chance of accidentally piercing the spinal cord, because there is no spinal cord down here. There's only spinal nerves. They don't want to hit a spinal nerve, but that would be better than hitting the spinal cord with the needle. Okay? And let's look now at the histological cross-sections of the spinal cord, or just a cross-section of the spinal cord. The gray matter forms this central kind of H or butterfly shape. And you remember it's gray, or if you remember why it's gray, it's mostly neuron cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. There's the posterior dorsal horns. Notice they go all the way to the edge of the spinal cord. There's the edge of the spinal cord. And there are sensory neurons here, in the sense that the sensory neurons are coming in through the dorsal root. There's a dorsal root ganglion. Notice the swelling. Dorsal root, rootlets, merging into the spinal cord. So right about here is where the sensory neurons synapse with usually interneurons. Okay? In the dorsal or posterior horns of the gray matter of the spinal cord. The anterior or ventral horns, notice they do not come all the way to the edge of the spinal cord. Right? It ends before that. Here are the cell bodies of the motor neurons, and then their long extensions, axonal fibers or extensions, come out of the spinal cord, going into the ventral rootlets, ventral root, and then as they meander further, they eventually merge to form the spinal nerve, which you can kind of get a sense of right here. And then the central canal, that little gap there, that little opening, that space, that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And as we get into the brain, we'll see that the central canal is continuous with the spaces, the ventricles within the brain, also filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Here's another diagram of this slide, cross-section of the spinal cord. There we go. There's your landmark, dorsal or posterior root ganglion. So that's a dorsal root, sensory, coming in. They don't show the rootlets here. Those sensory neurons in blue synapse with interneurons within the gray matter, right, of the spinal cord. So those neurons will synapse with cell bodies of motor neurons in the ventral or anterior gray matter horns, or horns of the gray matter. And then their axons or their fibers will exit the spinal cord via the ventral root, sometimes called the anterior root, the motor root. And then as we move away from the spinal cord, they merge into the spinal nerve. And the spinal nerves have both sensory and motor neurons, so they are mixed nerves. Okay? Don't worry about the breakdown of the gray matter in the sense of somatic, visceral, autonomic, and somatic. Just know that in the gray matter, the dorsal horns have the termination or the ending of the sensory neurons, the beginning of interneurons, and then in the anterior or ventral horn, that's where the interneurons synapse with the cell bodies of the motor neurons, and their axons or their fibers exit the spinal cord there. All right? And we'll see later on reflexes that the simplest reflex has a sensory neuron that goes all the way in and synapses directly with the motor neuron, with no interneurons associated with it. Okay, so continuing with the anatomy of the spinal cord, the white matter. So the reason the gray matter is gray because it's cell bodies, neuronal cell bodies, and unmyelinated axon, giving it a darker appearance. They call it gray matter. The white matter, notice it surrounds the gray matter in the spinal cord. The white matter is arranged into columns, and the columns are going to go superiorly and inferiorly, up and down. We can't get a sense of that here because this is just a thin cross-section, but they're going, and the white matter is arranged in columns to send sensory input up into the brain and to allow motor outputs to exit the brain and come down through the spinal cord so that they can synapse with motor neurons to exit the spinal cord. So there are posterior, lateral, and anterior columns. So posterior, right? Dorsal, where's that? Find your landmark, dorsal root ganglion. So then this is the dorsal area, or posterior. So these are the posterior columns. Okay, white columns. Lateral, there you go. And then by default, here's the anterior white matter columns. Don't worry about this leg, hip, trunk, and arm. We're not going to worry about the localizations of the columns in the spinal cord. Just simply know that there's posterior, lateral, and anterior. And we can also call it dorsal, lateral, and ventral white columns. So a track, these are axons within the columns. And if you remember from our previous chapter, tracks are arrangements of axonal fibers, neuron fibers, neuron axons that basically have a similar starting and ending point. Come on, cursor. So they're referred to as tracks. So ascending tracks, right, going up to the brain. These are sensory afferent impulses that are being sent to the brain. So if you pet your cat and cat's nice and soft fur, right, that sensory input goes in via a sensory neuron. That sensory neuron synapses with interneurons in the gray matter, initially in the dorsal or posterior horns. And to get that info to the brain, because we're in the spinal cord here, those interneurons associate with other sensory afferent neurons, and they send that sensory input up to the brain via ascending tracks within the white columns of the spinal cord. Okay? Then descending tracks. Let's say that you're petting your kitty cat, and you want to continue petting the cat, from the head to the back, so you're moving your arm. So then your brain decides to do that. Pet the cat, move your hand from the head to the body of the cat. So then your brain sends those motor neuron impulses, action potentials, nerve impulses from the brain down to the spinal cord through descending tracks from the brain to the spinal cord, or down through the spinal cord. Those motor commands are coming down efferent motor neurons, and they will synapse with interneurons in the gray horns, lateral or anterior ventral. And then they synapse with the motor neurons in the anterior ventral horns, and then those motor neurons send that motor action potential impulses out of the spinal cord, anterior ventral horn, spinal nerve out to the musculature in your arms to allow you to pet the cat. Okay, so again, you have ascending tracks, sensory input to the brain, descending tracks, motor output, motor commands from the brain. Okay, all in the white columns. We're not going to worry about exactly where in the white columns, just in the white columns, the white matter of the brain. So here's a little diagram that shows in purple motor commands. Notice follow